Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Lee. Yeah, on the surface of it, a dry topic, but when you burrow into the origins and the operations of the society over time, it becomes anything but dry, and I hope I can convey to you this evening some of the interest that, well, really the aura almost that surrounds the society. As Lee mentioned, I've been with the society for 56 years, and that came about because in 1970, along with Brian Ward, I took up a position as a full-time tutor while doing some postgrad work in the geography department at Adelaide Uni. There was a very formidable geographer at Adelaide University in those days by the name of Anne Marshall, a very distinguished geographer, a dynamic geographer, and a force to be reckoned with. Anne made it absolutely clear to Brian and I that now that we were staff members, albeit of limited tenure at the geography department, it was incumbent on us to pull our weight and join the society and get involved in its activities. And she almost walked us or frog-marched us down North Terrace by the ear to sign us up within a few days of getting into the department. Anne will recur later in the story. Not content with having signed us up to this society, she actually drafted us onto the council within the next 12 months. So that was really a baptism of fire for Brian and I to have gone from being members of 12-month standing to suddenly find ourselves sitting on the society, which was a very august body, I must say. I remained on council until 1987, but I thought that was pretty good at the time, but it was nothing compared to others. I said to Ken Peake-Jones, who of course wrote the Society's history, The Branch Without a Tree. We left council at the same time, and I said to Ken, Ken, I've had 16 years on the Society, I think it's time to have a rest. And he said, yes. He said, I agree. He said, I've been on it for 34. And so but Warren Benathan sat on it for 50 years. But I think towards the end, he was really there to get to the 50 years. Warren used to nod off to sleep quite early in the meeting, and we would discreetly wake him up at the end of the meeting. But if we have a look at but it was certainly one of those bodies that once you got onto, you were expected to serve your time on. You weren't expected to go onto the society for just a year or two. You were expected to be there for some considerable time. I think it's worthwhile having a look at the makeup of the council and the society at the time that Brian and I got active in it. Brian came onto the council at the same time as me, as I mentioned, but sitting around the council table were a mixture. It was really a mixture of, there were three different groups of people there. On the one hand, we still had sitting around the table the old Adelaide family names. Predictably, there was the Benathan representation, the Finnis, the Newlands, the Symes, etc. There's quite a lot of them. And they were people, in some cases, who'd been with the society right from the word go. And then, in addition to those stalwarts, those family people who almost felt that it was incumbent on them, it was part of the family tradition to go on the society's council and be active on the society, almost by birthright. You had enthusiasts for geography and history, and these were basically non-professional people who hadn't been formally trained in geography, but who had a very lively interest in it, and in a lot of cases, a very considerable expertise. And I think of someone like Ron Prate, for example. Ron Prate was on the Society's council for a long time, and Ron was quite a considerable local historian in his own right, and a pretty fine geographer too. He straddled both disciplines, and yet he had no, or little or no formal training in those areas. And then of course you had the academics and professionals, and they'd been thin on the ground originally, of course, and I'll say more about that in a moment, but they were the three classes of councillors sitting around the table at the time that Brian and I joined it over half a century ago. And I think in a lot of ways that represented a microcosm of the society and the way it had evolved from the beginning. I want to go back to the beginnings of the society. I think it would be true, in fact it's no new suggestion at all, to describe the Western world in the 19th century as a world in ferment, intellectual ferment. If you think of the great thinkers of the time, the great scientists of the time, you know, we had Lyell with his principles of geological uniformitarianism, who suddenly gave to geology deep time. And I think until Lyell came along and gave it that sense of deep time, people were still living with biblical notions of Earth having been created very quickly and life having been created very, very quickly. But you had Lyell, and then of course you had Darwin, and Darwin was like a comet traversing the intellectual skies at that time. Nothing could ever be the same after Darwin's evolution of species. And of course you had Huxley and a whole sort of group of outstanding, a lot of continental figures as well, a lot of French scientists. The Western world was really an intellectual ferment, and that was reflected by soirees and conversations that were going on at the time. People would get together in salons and talk about the latest ideas to being aired around the place. And that in turn was reflected in the establishment of learned societies. So our counterpart in the UK, the RGS of London, not the parent body, I hasten to add, not the parent body of any of the geographical societies in Australia, but the RGS London was established quite early, 1830. The Adelaide Philosophical Society, which later became the Royal Society, and which is still going, was established in 1856. The Royal Society of South Australia is our companion body in the sciences, just as the RGS looks after the geographical side of things, the spatial side of things, human relationships in the spatial world. So the Royal Society looks after the natural and the physical sciences and provides a body to air the latest ideas, to put out publications in the same way that our society does. The Society's beginnings really go back a little bit before 1885. They go back to 1883, when in Sydney, a meeting of worthies with an interest in geography and history and historical geography from all over Australia came together and resolved that there should be a Geographical Society of Australasia. The Victorian branch of the Geographical Society of Australasia was established in that year, 1883, but South Australia was reluctant. And a lot of that reluctance, I think, can be traced back to figures like Todd. Sir Charles Todd, he was very active in the scientific world. I mean, he was just one of those impressive figures that comes along from time to time. He was very active in the Royal Society, and he felt that the Royal Society of South Australia could quite adequately cope for the spatial sciences and the interest that people had in geography, And he thought that establishing a geographical society in South Australia would detract or be in competition, might be seen to be in competition with the Royal Society. But interestingly, Baron Ferdinand von Muller in Victoria, a very influential figure, one of those giants of his time who bestrode the natural sciences and botany in particular in the second half of the 19th century, he was very keen to get branches going all over Australia. And he did a lot of heavy lobbying. And there are letters in the Society's archives from von Muller in this amazing sprawling script, which I have no hope of deciphering, but obviously people could. And he did a lot of heavy lobbying and urging South Australia to establish a branch. And a number of worthies decided that it was worth pushing on in spite of Todd's reservations. And so on the 10th of July 1885, 32 gentlemen, no ladies, gentlemen, 32 gentlemen attended and agreed amongst themselves, apparently quite amicably, that we should go ahead and found a South Australian branch of the Geographical Society of Australasia. So not long afterwards, after lots of behind-the-scenes activity, there was an inaugural meeting held in the Adelaide Town Hall. I haven't actually seen a figure for that, but it's described as largely attended in the sort of language of the times, a largely attended meeting at the Adelaide Town Hall, 22nd of October, 1885. And it was very much a roll call of South Australia's rich and powerful. We had names like Elder and Ayres and Gill and Davenport and Bonython, among many others. These are the family names that continued to be very closely associated, many of them, not all of them, but many of them with the Society over the decades. And the South Australian government, because there were so many influential figures involved, and they had the ear of parliamentarians, and they were probably all members of the Adelaide Club, they managed to prevail upon the government of the time to throw its weight behind the new society. And so the society benefited from free printing, for example, and telegrams, no cost for telegrams. And the society's proceedings, which changed a lot over the years, but initially in this quite small format, no cost for printing those, and no cost for the favoured communication mode of the day, the telegram. Sir Samuel Davenport was the foundation president. He'd come over to South Australia quite some years beforehand with his brother, and they'd established themselves on property down in the southern Mount Lofty Ranges. And he became very influential in the colony. He was a great acclimatiser. He was interested in bringing into South Australia all sorts of plants that he thought would be economically important and useful. And he was a considerable landholder in his own right. He had agricultural land in the south, he had pastoral holdings in the north, and he was very highly respected. And he presided over his interests from Beaumont House, which most of you will now know as a property in the care and ownership of the National Trust of South Australia, up the top of Glenburn Road, or as it used to be called, up the top Beaumont Road. That's the outside of Beaumont House, top left, and Sir Samuel in his study down in the right-hand side. Nothing much has changed if you go into Beaumont House. His study is still very recognisable. In fact, we launched the 1985 centenary celebrations from that study. And as I say, very, very little had changed. But he bestrode Adelaide society for a long time. But of course it wasn't just Sir Samuel, who was very influential in Adelaide society and throwing his weight behind the RGS. You had people of the stature of George Woodroffe Goyder. You know, George Woodroffe Goyder was a very, very significant figure, as we all know. We all know about Goyder's line, but that was only part of the story of Goyder. Books have been written about him, academic articles have been published on him. Michael Williams, a former president and historical geographer of this society, gave his presidential address on Goyder. Used to be it's lapsed now, but there used to be a long-standing tradition that the president of the society would give a presidential address, and Michael's was on George Goyder. I remember the academic work that I did in my postgrad days was using a lot of records of the old Department of Lands, no longer with us. It was disbanded in the 1990s. But the people up there used to say, I think with good justification, that Goyder was only second in his influence in his time to the Governor of South Australia, because it was a time that recognised parties in the way that we have discrete, well-organised parties of the kind that we have now weren't really around. Really, governments were a loose coalition of people who could for a little while get along, and then they fairly quickly couldn't get along. And so governments would rise and fall in quick succession. And so when you had a figure like Goyder, who was enormously powerful and knowledgeable as a senior mandarin in the state government, they wielded far more power than any chief executive could wield today. With the type of government we have today, as opposed to the type of governments that we had in quick succession. You know, one would rise, fall, another would rise, fall, and so on, right through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and of course that's when Goyder was at his height. So, you know, while premiers came and went and governments came and went, George Goyder just kept on going. And to have a man of a public servant of that status, active in the society, not only active in it, but a president of the society, you can imagine the clout that gave to the society in those days. And when the society spoke, ministers and premiers, they listened. And in no small way, it was because of the influence of people like that. So Thomas Elder was another one like Goyder, a founder, a president, and of course sponsor of the Elder expedition, which I'll talk a little bit more about further into the lecture. Sir Thomas Elder would be very well known to most of you. Formed a very considerable pastoral empire and stockbroking empire. He also had mining interests. He had multitudinous business interests and became very, very wealthy indeed. And he was a very strong supporter of the society in its early days. They didn't explicitly set out their objectives, but they boiled down really to the promotion. The early society wanted to promote geography through support of exploration, and that was first and foremost what they wanted to do. Because not only had the 19th century been that time of intellectual and scientific ferment that I talked about at the outset, but it was also a time when the British Empire, of course, was very, very significant globally. And the British were intent on filling in what they thought were the blanks in the worlds that they'd either acquired or conquered, taken over one way or another, that they had become the dominant presence in. And they had this belief really that until they got out and explored the country, it was unknown. And so notwithstanding that Indigenous people had been in Australia for 65,000 years plus, the early colonists and the early Royal Geographical Society of South Australia believed that there were still blanks that nothing was known about. Probably some of you will have seen, in fact, in primary school atlases, some of the older ones, the interior, and that they show exploration, European exploration by periods. And much of Central Australia is black. It's unknown, and the legend actually says unknown. Well, of course, it was only unknown to Europeans. Indigenous people knew it intimately. I was only reading an article today about how Kimberley, in the song cycles of even the Kimberley people, the location of almost every significant waterhole in Central Australia was embedded, not just in the Kimberleys, but in the Tanami and the Great Sandy Desert, and Central Australia, the Range Country. Almost all of the waterholes were embedded. It was a form of mapping, if you like, through the song cycles. People would learn where these important physical features were located. So they knew almost every inch of the country. But Europeans, in their arrogance, our arrogance, couldn't or wouldn't believe that that could be the case. And so they thought that there was a vast swathe of country in Central Australia that simply had to be explored and plotted and charted by them, by Europeans, by Britons mainly, British mainly. And so the early society was very much about supporting exploration. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But it was also about building a geographical library. And of course, it was about giving public lectures and bringing out publications. In fact, for many years, many decades, you couldn't have a paper published in the Society's proceedings unless it had been given as a lecture. It was incumbent on you as a lecturer to make your lecture available to be published in the proceedings. The proceedings changed over time, and they moved up to this larger size. And a councillor of the day, when this was done, rather disparagingly referred to the new magazine, and didn't think that it would be very good. It's a matter of fact now that in the digital world we no longer have the printed journal, that its role is being taken over progressively by online material, but that certainly was one of the early objectives of the society. If we look at expeditions, the Elder Scientific Expedition is probably the best known one that the society was involved with. Elder professed really that it was a scientific expedition, and it was called that, the Elder Scientific Expedition. But Elder, there's no doubt whatsoever that Elder put money into it because he thought that he should be in on the ground floor if there were significant mineral discoveries or good pastoral land was discovered. He had a commercial interest in it, and that's why he stumped up the money for it. He had the wherewithal, both in cash and in terms of experience with camels. He'd been the first person to introduce camels on a really large scale into Australia. A few had trickled in decades before, but he started getting them in from the 1860s onwards. And so he said, look, I'll put up the money for an expedition, and I suppose to dress it up and give it some respectability, it also had to be scientific. And so scientific personnel were engaged for it. But it was doomed from the start. There were two problems with the Elder expedition. One, if you look at the instructions, and the Society has published the instructions manual that was put together for the leader of the expedition, David Lindsay. If you have a look at the instructions that were given, it was almost laughable. The expedition was expected to go through the Great Victoria Desert, up through the Great Sandy Desert, and then swing across the Tanami into the Simpson Desert, and then back to Adelaide. An impossible task, out of the question, couldn't possibly done, especially in those times, with camels and the provisioning you needed for men to be out for that length of time. And you can see a map in the instructions to the leader about what he has to do. This is actually plotted out. You can see all the big deserts, and the expedition is to go and explore all of these deserts, and at the same time carry out important scientific work and map the country. And that latter objective, to not only explore the country but to map it and to put together a scientific description of it, sets you up with some fundamental incompatibilities. Scientists, natural scientists and physical scientists, need time when they're in the field. And if they're spending almost all their time perched up on a camel, they're not going to be able to spend the time down on the ground doing the sorts of things that scientists need to do. For example, collecting reptiles or shooting birds and taking the skins, preserving the skins from museums and naming of new species and so on. Geologists need to get out with the geologist pick and roam around and spend time on rocky outcrops. And some of the naturalists of the day, in commenting on this, described how frustrating it was. On the one hand, they'd be sitting up on the camel and they had a wonderful view down to the ground, and they would see a lizard scurry across and dart into a burrow, or they would see an interesting insect, a beetle slowly plodding across the sand dune. But by the time they'd hushed the camel down, whatever it was that there was their object of interest would long have disappeared. And of course, if the camels, as they usually were in a string, then you would be delaying the whole string. And they had a lot of camels, believe me, that you would be delaying the whole expedition while you wanted to go down and look at a beetle. and so that they would be enormously frustrated. And even people like Wells and Lindsay, the leaders and the surveyors who were tasked with the business of making maps, they were also impelled in their instructions to move quickly. And you know, they, as I said, they had all these deserts that they were supposed to be encompassing and exploring and mapping and describing. And you can't do that sort of thing quickly. Again, just as the natural scientists need to get down and poke around, so the surveyors need time to fix the major features, to do their triangulation, their chaining, or whatever it is that they're going to do, to make maps, because maps are important. They were as important then as they are now. So it was almost doomed from the outset, and it ended in discord. It ended in the leader, David Lindsay, being recalled to Adelaide to explain to the council of the society why it had all fallen apart, because the scientific staff resigned en route when they got into the settled country of Western Australia. And Wells, who took over command, Larry Wells, the surveyor, took over command, and he had to wait for instructions from the council back here in Adelaide as to what he was to do, and eventually the whole expedition was terminated. And Ken Peake-Jones, who is the official recorder of the Society's history in the branch without a tree, Ken Peake-Jones is inclined to the view that it was a disaster from the beginning and nothing of value came out of it. I don't share that view. I've actually had a good look at the scientific outcomes of the expedition. They were printed in the transactions of the Royal Society, most of them. They're available in the libraries, and they're pretty impressive, in my opinion. I don't think Ken really appreciated these scientific outcomes. in the way that they warrant or to the extent that they merit. And I would actually say that although it did end in discord and a lot of unhappiness, the scientific outcomes were remarkably good when you consider the difficulties that the scientific staff were labouring under. I think a lot came out of it. And I think it's probably still yet to be fully appreciated and written up. The next big expedition that the Society got involved in was the Calvert expedition. Calvert was a wealthy businessman from the UK who funded an expedition through the Great Sandy Desert. They started in the goldfields area of Western Australia, went due north, right up through the middle of the Great Sandy Desert at a very hot time of the year, and it ended in tragedy with 2 deaths. Larry Wells, whose reputation had been riding high at that stage, came under sustained fire in the South Australian press because he allowed a couple of very inexperienced members of the party to go off on a flying side trip, what they called a flying trip. A small party moving very rapidly, going out to have a look while the main expedition party plodded on northwards. They were to go out to one side and see what they could find. Well, they got lost, they ran out of water and they perished. Wells found their mummified bodies sometime later. There were numerous expeditions, emergency parties went out looking for them, but it all ended in tears with the death of 2 young men. The other big expedition of the 1890s was the Horn expedition, which the RGS only had a minor role in. It was mainly organised out of Melbourne, and it was pretty successful. Very good scientific outcomes, a very interesting story in its own right, which has been written up. There was a Centenary conference in Alice Springs in 1994, and that has got some very interesting papers sort of looking back and looking forward. But as I say, the RGS only had a fairly minor role in that one. The Society also wanted to disseminate geographical knowledge, and obviously one way of doing that is by having a good library, and its ambitions were high. They set the bar high, and they wanted a world-class library, and fortuitously, in the early years of the 20th century, they were offered the Yorkgate Library, which had been amassed by Stephen William Silver in the UK. Silver was an interesting fellow. He was a merchant and a manufacturer. He got into gutta percha quite early. Gutta percha is a very coarse, hard form of rubber. And whether he was prescient in getting into that field or whether it was just fortuitous that he was getting into it at the same time that telecommunications were getting going, we'll probably never know. But of course, submarine cables were being put down under oceans at that stage. And of course, we haven't long had the sesquicentenary of the Overland Telegraph from Adelaide to Darwin, or Port Darwin as it was then. And of course, the underground sections of the cable, had to traverse rocky seabeds and sharp coral reefs, and you needed to have that critical cable enmeshed by something pretty solid. And so the cabling for the telegraphy of the day was enmeshed in these quite thick gutta percha cables, or protective sheaths, really, you probably describe them. I've seen them, and they're quite thick, as they had to be, and it's very, very hard. And Silver had made a lot of money out of that, and he'd had an agent amass an extraordinary collection of rare books, maps and manuscripts, and the Society was given the option of purchasing it. It was offered for $2,000, £2,000, which even then would have been well below its market value, I'm sure. These days, it's very hard, if not impossible, to put a value on a library of such rare material, but it's undoubtedly in the millions, many millions, its current day value. £2,000 in those days, for what it's worth, roughly translates to about $300,000 in today's values, but I mean, that's grossly undervaluing it. As I said, it's worth millions, no question. So really the society fell on its feet with that. It was able to buy it by allocating £1,700 from the elder bequest. When elder died, he left the society a bequest of £2,000, and they used 1,700 of that towards purchasing the Yorkgate Library, and the remainder of that sum came from private donations. I don't think the government put money into it, I just can't quite remember. But anyway, they were able to buy it. Elder shipped it over at no cost to the society, and it was a huge collection. And it came over in big timber crates. And while they were wondering what to do with it, Elder allowed it to be stored in the basement of one of his buildings, one of his many buildings around Adelaide. And it sat there while the society talked to the government and the government talked to the society. And eventually, the government extended the institute building that we're in now. They extended it northward, fundamentally to accommodate the Yorkgate Library, to provide a home for the Yorkgate Library and also accommodation for the RGS and the Royal Society of South Australia. So the present fabric of this very building you can trace back to the acquisition of the Yorkgate Library. Well, that was a highlight, but it wasn't all highlights. In fact, the society struggled in the early 20th century. It still only had a small membership, although it had these prominent Adelaide names, old Adelaide names associated with it, and influential movers and shakers who had the government's ear. It was still a struggling society with all the sorts of growing pains that you can imagine with a society trying to get going. Accommodation was problematic. They shifted from pillar to post in those early years before they finally got some space down here. Precarious finances, they actually employed debt collectors, if you can imagine that. I think it's Ken Peake Jones has a wry comment in his book that prominent Adelaide society people were happy to lend their name to the society, but less happy about dipping into their pockets to help the society, even with their membership fees. So one of the, I think it was a member of the council, was actually, I can't remember his name, he was actually paid to go around and knock on doors and say, you need to pay the RGS. You're unfinancial. And of course, prominent early supporters had dwindled, Elder had gone, and you know, when you lose people of that sort of stature, Goyder have gone, it's going to set any fledgling organisation back. The home that the Yorkgate Library got in the State Library was hard fought, hard won, and it brought into being a formal affiliation with the State Library of South Australia. And that new accommodation that I was talking about was opened formally in 1908. The affiliation with the library has produced a lot of benefit, no question but it has also produced a lot of discord over the years, and I'll talk about that a little later. If we look at the years, say, after World War I, the 20s, 30s, into the early 40s, which I've called the middle years, the society was changing. In the early days, I mean, geography as a discipline wasn't really around, as a formal academic discipline, wasn't really around. And so you had enthusiastic amateurs, as I mentioned earlier, and you had prominent citizens of Adelaide who had an interest, almost a dilettante interest in geography. But you didn't have professional geographers until you got the likes of Charles Fenner and Archibald Grenfell Price. I mean, these names resonate when you're talking about Adelaide of those decades. They were very influential. Charles Fenner was very prominent in the State Education Department. He was a prolific writer of geography textbooks. In fact, I was still using in primary school some of the material that Charles Fenner had written decades before, and I'm sure a number of you were too. And Archie Grenfell Price, well, he was a polymath. You know, he was just an extraordinary live wire of an academic, and very influential in federal government circles too. He's into everything. If there was something happening in Australia, you'd find his paw prints on it somewhere. He was an extraordinary fellow. He was he headed up St Mark's College for quite some years, among other things, and he was still around when I was working in the geography department. He would sometimes come in for morning tea. Peter, you'd remember Archie coming in for morning tea. Remember Graham Lawton hosting Archie occasionally for morning teas. So people like that started to give geography respectability. And that was reflected in the fact that the society was tasked with producing South Australia's official Centenary History. Now, I suspect some of you, probably many of you, haven't seen it. I didn't bring it along tonight because it's quite a tome, it's heavy, and I didn't want to carry it a great distance, but it's yay thick. And it's actually, all the papers in it were published in the Society as a supplement to one of the Society's issues of the proceedings, and then bound up into a book which was sold as the state's official history, which was quite a feather in the Society's cap, and it still holds up pretty well. If you go and look through it, you know, it's a pretty good account of the state up to that point. I mean, it's dated, of course, but it was quite an impressive achievement at the time, and the Society, it ran the show. It took on the task and it delivered. The two people I've been talking about, Charles Fenner on the left and the mercurial Archie Grenfell Price on the right. Two very, very different personalities. You could hardly think of two more different personalities. And speaking of personalities, we have here what I've called the last of the classic explorers who were also active in the Society, C.T. Madigan and Sir Douglas Mawson in the field. This is an interesting photo because you won't often see photos of Madigan and Mawson together because they didn't get on very well. They didn't like each other fundamentally. They were big men, both physically and intellectually, and they were rivals. They were rivals in the Antarctic, and they were rivals in geology, and they were rivals in terms of influence in the young University of Adelaide and in Adelaide society generally. Mawson had the upper hand in this rivalry because he was just that bit older than Madigan, and he'd got established before Madigan. So Madigan was his 2IC in the Antarctic, and Madigan was his 2IC in the geology department, and so it was always Mawson who was the primary figure, not Madigan, and that irked Madigan, and there was real friction between them. Adelaide wasn't really big enough for both of them. They were big people. Mawson was president of the RGS in 32. Madigan wasn't, but he was a member, and he benefited from his membership of the Society by being sponsored by the RGS's president from 1925 to 30 of A.A. Simpson, of the Simpsons manufacturing complex, you know, the washing machine people. Tinsmiths started off as tinsmiths in Gawler Place and became very prominent white good manufacturers. And A.A. Simpson sponsored both Madigan's interest in Lake Eyre and his scientific party that went across the Simpson Desert in 1939. The likes of Archie Grenfell Price and his colleagues were very active in lobbying for geography. They really wanted academic recognition. The first lecture, geography had first been offered as a first-year subject in arts in 1904, but nothing much happened after that. It didn't. In fact, nothing much happened really until there was a Department of Professorial position established as late as 1959 when Graham Lawton became the professor. I think he'd been there before as a reader, but the department and that professorial position wasn't established until 59. So, you know, that was only a few years before some of us started off there as students. Lee, in his introductory remarks, alluded to the fact that the Society's got this outwardly staid and respectable, sober image, but it has been internally riven at times, no question. There have been real internal tensions. One of the tensions, and it seems strange these days, but one of the tensions in the 30s especially, and into the 40s, was the place of history. Historians wanted a professional body, and they didn't have one. And so they joined the Geographical Society, and they wanted to promote history through the Royal Geographical Society. And the Society said, well, this is about geography, it's not about history. But eventually they formed their own division within the Society, the Historical Division. And there would be protracted debate about the place of history in the Society and whether it really fitted and you wonder today how that could have been. Well, it's no longer an issue, of course, because we have a Historical Society of South Australia for a start, and historians have now got their own professional body to promote the subject, just as geographers have had for the last century and a half almost. But there was also rancorous debate within the Society in the 1960s about whether the Society should hand over its library to the State Library in return for a government grant, a guaranteed government grant. The Society's always been scraping around for shekels, and some people, and interestingly, a very conservative figure by the name of Harold Finnis, who was actually on the Society when I joined the Society. He'd been secretary of the Royal Agricultural and Horticultural Society. Harold Finnis had promoted very strongly in the 1960s this notion of handing over ownership of the library to the State Library. And it got very, very heated. One of the key opponents was E.B. Scarfe, who was the Crown Prosecutor in South Australia at the time, and he was very strongly opposed to the Society handing over its library collection to the government through the State Library, and there were some very, very harsh words spoken at the meetings. Reading between the lines, it was a very, very bitter debate. I want to mention some of the work done in the late 20th century. Lake Eyre had a very significant flooding in 1949-51, not as significant as 74-76, but because there'd been no considerable flood in Lake Eyre up until 49-51, the Society, I think very well, to their credit, dispatched scientific members of the Society to Lake Eyre to do some good work up there. Warren Benathan, he was an industrial chemist at that stage, and he worked for ICI, and of course ICI had an interest in salt, And so Warren was interested in the salt potential of Lake Eyre, and it turned out there wasn't any for various reasons. But he got hooked on Lake Eyre, and he subsequently spent a lot of time there and wrote about it, and what do you call it? Circumambulated around it, walked around it, and walked in the middle of it, and he became very, very interested in Benitha. But you also had Bruce Mason, who lectured a number of people in this room in climatology and basic meteorology. Bruce was up there, penman, scientist, interested in all this sort of thing from the UK. And the Society put out a very good publication about that flooding. And then with an even bigger flood in 74, 76, the Society this time didn't put a party into the field like it did in 49, 50, but instead it convened a forum of researchers. There were lots of people in the universities interested in this flooding, lots of departmental interest, lots of interest all round. And the Society, Warren Benitha and myself, convened this research group, and another publication came out of that. And that's available for sale by the Society if anyone's interested in it. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, there were collaborative studies done between this Society, Western Mining. At that stage, they were developing the Olympic Dam, copper, gold, silver mine at Roxby Downs, Olympic Dam. And the SA government, they were the principal collaborators, and out of that came a series of 6 volumes on the work that was collaboratively done up there around Lake Eyre South. It was all tied up with the environmental impact work. It was a sort of a spillover from that, and it generated some controversy. Some people in the Society thought that this was Western Mining, who had a reputation that not everyone was happy with, and some people in the Society were worried that they were greenwashing their image by engaging the Society in an exercise like this, that they wanted to promote a green and caring image, and if they involved the Society, then that could only be a good thing for them. There'd been a similar debate in the Royal Geographical Society London around about that time about BP and its activities in Nigeria, and BP were giving lots of money to the Royal Society London, and again members there were concerned that it was greenwashing. BP was greenwashing their image through the Royal Geographical Society London, so there was a bit of unease about it. But I'd have to say the volumes that came out are pretty good, pretty useful. The Society's centenary, Viceroy Gould dinner and launch of Branch Without a Tree. I probably didn't make enough at the beginning of the title of the book. It sort of goes back, of course, to the fact that the original goal of that meeting back in Sydney all those years before had been an Australasian society, and each state would be a branch. But as it turned out, to mix the metaphors, most of the state branches withered on the vine, and only Queensland and South Australia have survived to the present. Even the Victorian one came to grief. But we soldier on, and in 1985 we celebrated our centenary with that Viceroy Gould dinner and launch in Sir Samuel Davenport's study. How we all fitted in there, I'm not quite sure, but we did. And there was a grand dinner that night, and all sorts of interesting things happened. There was an outback. There was some outback travel to Haddon Corner in the far northeast extremity of the state. A couple of coaches went up there with Society members and met Queensland members there on site. There was a group that went up to Warriner and put in a plaque at the old Warriner siding for the Elder expedition. And there was a rolling program throughout the year of exhibitions, special lectures and events. I want to finish up by just looking briefly at the 21st century, and it will only be brief. It would be fair to say that the first decade of the society's story in this century was coloured considerably by an acrimonious debate within the society about its future, and in particular its relationship with the State Library on the one hand and the University of Adelaide on the other. There emerged two quite divergent schools of thought in the society. The official, if you like, the school of thought being promoted by the council of the society at this time and the president was that the society should move. The State Library was becoming a difficult landlord. In fact, things got to the point where the State Library actually issued a legal eviction notice on the society to move out. The relationship had deteriorated to that point, and a deadline was given. And if no action was taken to vacate this building, action would be taken. We weren't quite sure how we were going to move everything out to North Terrace and what we would do with it when we parked it out there. But it was a very tense time. The Libraries Board was hostile, the director of the State Library was hostile, and the society's governing body, the council, felt that you couldn't really live with a hostile owner. You know, you couldn't be a tenant with a hostile landlord. And so negotiations were entered into with the University of Adelaide with a view to the society shifting from the State Library to the University of Adelaide, and the library would go with it. And the society would sever all ties with the State Library and with the State Library building and so on. And a significant part of the society membership was not happy with that idea, particularly as it would mean interfiling of the society's library collection with the university library collection. In other words, the society would no longer have a discrete geographical collection of its own. The society would be housed down in the Bar Smith Library, and the books were to be housed there. Well, probably most would have subsequently gone off to storage, off-site storage, but the collection would be broken up. The Yorkgate Library would have lost its identity, and so on and so forth. Other collections would have lost their identity. And it came down to 3 special general meetings where votes were taken on what the course of the society should be. And at the final and deciding special general meeting, the membership voted to remain in spite of the hostile view of the State Library. In effect, the decision was to stare the library down and ignore the legal threat of eviction. And that is in fact what was done. And that is why we remain where we are today. It was a very difficult time, and I want to pay tribute in saying that it was a very difficult time. I want to pay tribute to Rod Shearing, because after the fracturing of the society into 2 camps, effectively, those who wanted to tough it out with the State Library and those who wanted to pack the society's bags and move off to the university. In the wake of that, the society was wounded, and it needed a stable person to settle things down and get things back on a steady, get the society back on an even keel. And I think Rod did that in spades, and I take my hat off to his role in this. He studiously remained neutral in the dispute that was going on at the time, and in coming back to the presidency for quite some years. I think he really was very, very significant in righting the ship. And I would say, as a person who's been actively involved in the society now for over half a century, the view from where I sit is that the society is not only stabilised, but it's actually now as strong as it has ever been in its history. It's very well led. We have an excellent president, obviously. We have a salaried director. We have very, very dedicated volunteers. If you ever come into the rooms on Tuesdays, for example, it's just a hive of industry, of society volunteers, members of the public coming in and out. And I think it bodes well. Of course, volunteer societies wax and wane. They're only as good as the people running them at any point in time. But my point is the society, I think now, is running as well as it has ever run. And I take my hat off to those who are responsible for that happy state. Now, I don't want to say much more. You can read the Branch Without a Tree. It's actually quite slender. It's not a very long read. It's only about 140 pages or so. It's a scholarly piece of work, but it's readable. Of course, there's the Society's proceedings, which also looked at various aspects of the Society's history over time. But it's been a very successful society. It's still around the fact that it's going so well now. I think it's a tribute to the fact that it's on sound footings. And Lee, I hope that it continues in that direction for many more years to come. So I'll stop talking at that point.
Hold on to that, because I'll ask some questions.